we're back in the car on a Sunday like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your late Sunday afternoon into early evening of Father's Day here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So I'm not going to do a Father's Day episode because it can get a little somber, a little melancholy, a little morose. This is the third Father's Day without my dear old dad, Alan Philip Cohen, the biggest movie fan and biggest New York Yankee fan that any of us would have ever known. But I don't want to be, this shouldn't be a depressing day. This should be to celebrate the fathers who are still in our lives. But I just want to kind of go back to talking movies. I don't want to get too far away to a Yankee episode, to a remembrance episode of a treasured and beloved family member. But in all the hullabaloo about Spaceballs to Schwartz Awakens. And there was some talk that Spaceballs originally was released on June 12th, 1987. 38 years ago, the day of the already iconic announcement from 98-year-old Mel Brooks. They wanted us to do a sequel, so we're going to do something else. You know, the Mel Brooks at 98, still cracking wise, still making jokes, puns. What a guy. But there is another legendary movie which was released on June 12th, 1987. Aside from Spaceballs. Also released 38 years ago, 3 days ago, was George Miller's quite extraordinary, somehow critically underappreciated, despite the crazy all-star roster of major players in Hollywood for decades, The Witches of Eastwick. And The Witches of Eastwick, the novel was written by, another big hitter in John Updike. I don't know anybody who read that book. I'm pretty sure my dad did not read it. Updike was not that wasn't one of his go-to authors. Dad, in the days before everything was on your phone, where the days where most people didn't even have cellular phones, Dad's go-to authors, Stephen King, Dean Koontz, and he liked Robert Ludlum. He liked John Grisham and, a little bit later era, Martin Cruz Smith, Andrew Vox, but I don't think any John Updike novels were on his shelves, and for sure, The Witches of Eastwick was not on his shelf. Dad had really an amazing collection of softcover, some legendary novels that ended up being made into movies. But he was not familiar with The Witches of Eastwick. And I remember vaguely when the movie came out, it was the summer in between 7th grade and 8th grade, although 7th grade hadn't quite wrapped up when this movie was released. It was a pretty good time for movies. I think 87, even though The Last Emperor, a film that almost nobody outside of movie critics saw, ended up winning the big prize at the Oscars the following year. But The Witches of Eastwick stars Cher, who would win an Oscar later that same year for Moonstruck. Cher just had a killer year in 1987. She had Suspect with Dennis Quaid, directed by the terrific Peter Yates and John Mahoney, and a young Liam Neeson, and Joe Mantegna, among others. Just a home run of a movie. Great suspense thriller, crime movie, courtroom drama, answers D, all three. And she had Moonstruck, and she had The Witches of Eastwick. And for me, the weird thing is, I feel like her best performance is in The Witches of Eastwick, but she gets the hardware, that's Cher, for Moonstruck. But I really love what she does in The Witches of Eastwick. And her co-stars, the actual witches of the title, if you believe in such things, were played by Susan Sarandon, who was still on the rise, and the always great Michelle Pfeiffer. Playing the man, is he really the antagonist? Is he a co-lead with the three ladies? I don't really know. But playing Daryl Van Horn, who may in fact not be Daryl Van Horn. Maybe there is no Daryl Van Horn. Daryl Van Horn may simply be the devil when he pretends to be like a regular person, similar to Jack's buddy, Big Al, 10 years later in The Devil's Advocate, playing John Milton, not an accidental name, Paradise Lost, right? This is not, they're really hitting you over the head if you have any idea of the literary references. He's not really running he's running a law firm, but he's the fucking devil, okay? He's the devil, and Jack as Daryl Van Horn is a kind of almost a different iteration of Satan. And in the same year, 3 months before The Witches of Eastwick releasing in June of 1987, Bobby D, Mr. De Niro himself, spoiler alert, he plays a character called Louis Cypher. I mean, that's really a nail meathead there, right? Louis Cypher, as Mickey Rourke famously points out. Louis Cypher. Lucifer. Even your name's a dime store joke. I don't think that Jack gives the most colorful performance of the three. That would have to go to Big Al. But Jack is very colorful. He is very broad. He gives an Al Pacino 90s style performance in this film. And then 2 years later, in Tim Burton's Batman 1989, there were a lot of people that says, well, Jack just he's supposed to be the Joker. It's the same guy he plays in The Witches of Eastwick. That I don't agree with. I think that there is a little bit of layering and there is more texture to Nicholson's performances in those films than he gets credit for. I love his work in both movies, but I think he's fantastic in The Witches of Eastwick. And one thing that time does to us is our perception of movies not only change, like films we thought were terrible. Wait, actually, I misjudged it. Movies such as Grand Canyon in 1991, The Fisher King. I saw both of those movies not long after they came out. I thought they were lousy, disappointed, and years later, I said, oh my God, these are two of the best films of the entire decade. What did I watch? Well, when I'm watching The Witches of Eastwick on HBO when it premiered in, spring, summer 1988, I'm seeing these three hot girls, no offense, these three hot girls in Cher, Susan Sarandon, and Michelle Pfeiffer going for this old guy. Why are they going for him? He's an old guy. Well, truth be told, to my 14-year-old virgin eyes, that era Jack Nicholson looked pretty old to me. Jack is younger in that movie than I am now, and that is a very humbling thing to comprehend. So he doesn't look so old. He still looks, I would say he looks older than me in this movie, especially when his character becomes disheveled. He looks like he's in his 60s. But this is a movie that I don't get why the critics didn't fully embrace it, because most audiences did, and it was a significant box office hit. It grossed about 3 times its production cost just here in the United States. The production and marketing budget, it's not as much as you would think. They kind of shot it, I don't want to say on the cheap, but the actors and actresses didn't make as much as they could have, for sure. It was $22 million to produce and market, and it grossed between 65 and 70 in the United States alone. I couldn't find a tally for the overseas gross, so you figure you had another 10 or 20. It's tough to gauge these things. But on top of the really terrific performances from the leads, from those 4, you have an actor who I briefly mentioned who is just about at the level of cheat code, almost always plays supporting roles in Richard Jenkins. And Richard Jenkins is so good in this film, playing the guy who runs the town newspaper that Michelle Pfeiffer's Suki works for. He's so good he could have gotten a Best Supporting Actor nomination for this movie. And his wife is played by an actress I've said before, I'm really hot and cold on, Veronica Cartwright. In the right role, she's magic. But I hated her character so much in this movie. I detested her. It almost ruined the movie the first time I saw it. I hate to say it, and again, spoiler alert, I wanted her character to die. Oops. I feel responsible. I apologize. It's not the actress, it's just the character it's just horrendous, and I'm sure she was even worse in the book, if I had to take a guess. But what I was saying about Jack and Big Al and Bobby D, Angel Heart 1987, a representation of Satan. Witches of Eastwick, representation of Satan. 10 years later, Big Al, Devil's Advocate, representation of Satan. De Niro is the only one who plays the devil the way that we think the devil probably is. De Niro plays the character of Cypher before we know who he really is, as if the name is just an accident. he plays him with such incredible menace. And yes, De Niro in certain roles could be intimidating. Max Cady in Cape Fear, but he's had a lot of roles where he plays very warm kind of characters, likable, relatable characters. He is all but spitting fire and brimstone in every scene, even though he rarely raises his voice much above a whisper. Jack goes broad in Witches of Eastwick. Jack gets the broads, but he goes broad in Witches of Eastwick. It is a stylistic choice. I assume it was the director's process and not just Jack doing his own thing. Like I feel that Martin Scorsese let Nicholson have a little bit too much control of his own performance, because I just don't like Jack's performance in The Departed. I'm sorry. I'm not a fan of that movie. Scorsese made 10 better movies than The Departed, and he ended up winning Best Picture and Director for that. You know, what can I tell you? I'm not a fan. It's okay. It's a 3-star movie. But The Witches of Eastwick also, and this is very important to note, as a fan of all-time classics, of movies which changed the business. John Williams did scores for, off the top of my head, 4 movies which changed the movie business. And Steven Spielberg and George Lucas would say, they would agree, without John Williams' work, none of their films or franchises would have reached the levels that he himself was the missing element. And it's kind of like what Sergio Leone said about his frequent collaborator Ennio Morricone. He makes my movies seem better than they are. He makes them seem more epic. And he, by virtue of his talent as a composer of film music, he makes the stories sing. He makes them more operatic than they would be otherwise. Well, when we think John Williams, generally speaking, the scores that come to mind of people my age and older, film historians, old heads, seam heads, statisticians, if you will, we think Jaws, we think Star Wars, we think OG Superman, the Christopher Reeve run, we think Indiana Jones, the Indy franchise, and even he worked on the last one, Dial of Destiny, well into his 90s already. What I would argue is the most underrated, incredible score from John Williams in his whole career. Some people will say Harry Potter. I love Harry Potter score. I love his work in Home Alone. The Witches of Eastwick is better than both of those scores, in my humble opinion. In fact, if you compare the Witches of Eastwick score to Home Alone and Harry Potter, you will say, okay, he took elements from his own work, turned them into something different, but he very clearly, it's like he was inspired by himself. But the Witches of Eastwick score was a major departure for John Williams. It does not sound like any other John Williams score. Quite frankly, it's closer to a James Horner, or, dare I say, his peer, a Jerry Goldsmith score. It sounds more like them than John Williams. And it showed that Williams was capable of doing almost anything when it came to composing film music. And the best quote ever about what a boss John Williams has been since the 60s is when Steven Spielberg was preparing Schindler's List, and it was a tough shoot. It was not a fun movie to make for every reason imaginable. But when Spielberg got his footage together and he presented Williams with, I don't think it was like a final cut. It was more like an assembly cut, but he had enough. He wanted, Williams to get started if he could, whatever. So when John Williams watched the footage that Spielberg gave to him for Schindler's List, he cried without any music, with just the actors doing their thing. He cried, and he supposedly said to Spielberg, "Steven, this is the best thing you've ever done, and you need a composer better than me to score this film. You need somebody better than me. I don't think I can do it." And Spielberg, according to his account, with a straight face, said, "John, I humbly and totally agree with you that I need a better composer than you for this movie. But they're all gone. They're all dead, John. You're the only one who can do this." If that is not the biggest compliment that someone can give within the ridiculous absurdity of the movie business, I have no doubt that story is true. It seems apocryphal, but I think it happened very close to that. And John Williams put together that score. But he is the best to ever do it. And his score for this film many people would say that, OG Superman, it almost sounds like a guy flying. It almost seems like if there were lyrics, it would be, look up in the sky, there's a guy flying. The Witches of Eastwick is whimsical, it's funny, but it's also scary. And the main theme, the main theme gets all of that. It's as if John Williams, similar to 6 years later, watched all of the footage that Miller gave him and figured out, here's how you do it. This is how you do whimsy, humor, horror, menace, shock. I do not have any idea how he managed to cram all of that into his main theme for the Witches of Eastwick, but he did. And the score was not necessarily underrated at the time. It was nominated for Best Musical Score. And many people probably figured, well, it's sort of a courtesy nomination because Williams is such a home run hitter. But in his career, this is his most underrated score, for sure. It is a gem, and it's almost like worth downloading on its own. You don't need the excuse of saying, oh, well, only, when you watch the movie. So the basic story, the plot, if you will, of the Witches of Eastwick is this kind of small town in, I think it was shot in Massachusetts, but I feel like it's supposed to be Rhode Island? Vermont? I don't even remember, because I know that it was filmed somewhere other than where it actually was supposed to be. Stephen King famously, everything is set in Maine or Bangor, Maine. I don't remember where Updike set the book. I know they shot it. It's not where it's purported to be. It's kind of like, using Vancouver to make believe you're in New York City kind of thing. But it's about these three women who are divorced, recently divorced, we are led to believe. In the case of Cher, she is a mom. In the case of Michelle Pfeiffer, she is a mom. And Susan Sarandon's character, I don't think she has any kids. I don't think that she's a mom. But they are all presented as very straightforward. They are women who are not immune, for better or worse, to the charms of men. They all had lousy marriages. They need something exciting in their life. And they appear to have a little bit of magical power. They appear to be witches, low-key, but they don't seem aware of their powers. At least this is what we're presented. And into this town, this small town where everybody knows everybody's business, a little bit like, Bridges of Madison County, the movie version with Clint, where everybody knows who's doing what with whom. Like everyone's got ears to the ground. Well, you have that kind of a dynamic going on in this film. So into this, it doesn't seem like a maelstrom, but it's about to be, walks Jack Nicholson's Daryl Van Horn. And he is not really a charmer in the conventional sense. And Jack Nicholson, in real life, is known as a ladies' man, a lady killer, a charmer, a very smooth operator, very suave, but he doesn't play that in this film. He plays Daryl Van Horn as crude, rude, crass, and offensive. And his process, because he has presumably supernatural powers, he seems to know exactly which version of him each woman shares. Alexandra, Susan Sarandon's Jane, Michelle Pfeiffer's Suki. He knows exactly how to be with each. And this is not something that I picked up on. I'm 14 years old. I'm angry. I am actively mad watching this movie because this old man, how does this old man get these girls? Oh, well, he's the devil. Fuck you. This was my attitude watching the movie. I still liked it, but I was upset. It didn't make sense to me. It was just not calculating. But he is very offensive to Alexandra when they meet. She goes to see him. He's got this unbelievable house. It's probably a $20 million, even back then, estate. And we don't know where he gets his money from. Well, no, we do know where he gets his money from, but we don't really know in the world of the how did Daryl Van Horn become this loaded? He offends her repeatedly. He talks down to her. He just acts like a jackass. No pun intended. But somehow that works as far as seducing her. I don't know. Then when he gets up close and personal with Jane, who is very, very uptight and very rigid, she needs something like this. She needs a fire lit within her. And then Michelle Pfeiffer's character, a little trickier. Jack just turns on the charm, and he doesn't pretend to have all the answers. And somehow that works. So whatever each woman needed from a guy, he can be that guy. He is that guy. Jack in this movie is that guy. And so for a time, you have what amounts to a menage a, I don't even know what it is. Menage a quad? I don't know. And all is happy in this small, everybody talks to everybody town, except that everybody talks to everybody. And there are issues, and the women they are kind of, I don't want to say blackballed, but they are figures of derision, where people are now talking about them as if they're doing something wrong. And this is also an element that didn't land for younger me. They are single. Okay? They have been successfully divorced from their husbands. Daryl Van Horn is a single guy. They are not hurting anybody. They are consenting adults, enjoying each other's company. It's nobody's business but their own. But because it's a small town, everyone's life gets upended, and the women make the decision, we need to extricate ourselves from Daryl. As much as we love being around the guy, and maybe at least one of us is in love with him, we can't continue in this fashion. So they pull back, and then you get the horror movie elements where Jack, as Daryl, starts to show that he's not just a normal rich guy who looks like Jack Nicholson. I mean, up to a certain point in this movie, it could be the character of Harry that he plays, Harry Sanborn, that he plays, 15, 16 years later in Something's Gotta Give, because the Jack Nicholson of that movie is older, but an aging lady killer who only goes for women probably half his age, but he is incalculably wealthy. In this film, he doesn't take too well to this rejection because it doesn't make any sense. He's not wrong, but circumstances take place and the women have to pull back, and he rebels in a very angry and, dare I say, satanic sort of way. And it's up to the women to figure out what sorts of powers they really do have, if any, and what can they do to stop him from wreaking havoc throughout the town and in their lives in particular. And are their children at risk, meaning their children, all of these things. And the movie does go down a dark path for a little bit of its running time. But the next laugh, the next show-stopping moment is always just around the corner. And in the career of Jack Nicholson, and there's talk maybe he's going to make a comeback. Supposedly he's looking at scripts. I mean, love to see it. He seems healthy. He attended a couple of Lakers games. He's mingling with LeBron and stuff like that. He seems like he's doing okay, but I don't know why he would want to sit in a makeup chair or sit in a fucking trailer again. I don't know why he'd want any part of that when he could just do his own thing every day. But there are those performances that never get mentioned in a person's career, or rarely get mentioned, because there's so much quality. In Jack Nicholson's career, there are so many different performances you can point to and say, that's a master craftsman at their best, right there. You could say it about Batman. You could say it about Chinatown. You could say it about Five Easy Pieces. You could say it about Easy Rider. You could say it about The Shining. You could say it about Schmidt, about As Good as It Gets, about Terms of Endearment. This is his most undersold great performance. For what he's able to do, he is able to craft a three-dimensional character. He's the fucking devil. How can the devil have more than one dimension? We'll leave it to Jack to figure out a way to come across as if he is a three-dimensional character. Pacino does not do that. He certainly got a lot of screen time, but Pacino was just having fun. Devil's Advocate, which I really like. I mean, it's a guilty pleasure movie. That's supposed to be a horror film, but all I remember is Al screaming and yelling, carrying on about God being, he's an absentee landlord! Worship that? Never! Just gold. Jack has moments where he's going nuts. There's the show-stopping scene I was referring to is where he's in a church. Again, not an accident. It happens in a church. and he starts carrying on about God, similar to Pacino 10 years later, but in a more comedic bent, deliberately comedic. And it is just amazing that somebody who appears to just be screaming and yelling can be making a point and can be hitting his marks exactly the way, like it doesn't feel outsized. It doesn't feel as if he's doing an Al Pacino. This is exactly how this character has been set up. This is probably what he would do in this exact circumstance, in this exact setting. It is a great movie, and it's at 67% on Rotten Tomatoes. So yeah, it's fresh. This movie should at least be in the 80s. I just don't get it. And I like to think that it will be rediscovered at some point because it is a timeless kind of story. This is not a story that is dependent on technology and you think, oh, this is really archaic. This is antiquated. No, this is the sort of film that works as if it were deliberately a period piece, and it's not. It was set in 86, 87 when it was shot. But there is something magical about the movie itself. There is a bit of surrealism and magical realism. And for me, there are no kind of slow spots or dead spots because you're really, the first time through, you don't know how the heck this is going to turn out. How far is Daryl going to go? How far are the women willing to go to kind of vanquish him in one form or another? And then you ask the question, well, can you ever really beat the devil, as Stephen King would say? I remember him talking about when they adapted his book, Needful Things. And he said, whatever you do, just remember, don't beat the devil, because you can't beat the devil. I mean, that was just Stephen King's perception. But in the world of this film, is it possible to vanquish Daryl Van Horn? Maybe you just need him to move away. Maybe he could sell that house. We'll pretend it's really just a guy. He could sell that house and go bother someone else. Maybe he can get a few other women in a delicate condition. But The Witches of Eastwick is a fantastic film. I mean, it's a better movie than Spaceballs, if we're being honest. Spaceballs, obviously, was also a movie that didn't do as well with critics as it should have. It was 52% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's absurd. The movie's a riot. And The Witches of Eastwick is a great film. I would say that of movies that are below 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, The Witches of Eastwick might be my favorite film. And a movie that I would say is just shy of a masterpiece. The score is just too low. I keep coming back to that, but it doesn't make sense why people didn't get it. But a lot of critics did. It got its share of 4-star reviews, made some 10 best lists, but a lot of people just shrugged and said, yeah, Jack being Jack, it's silly. It can't decide if it wants to be a comedy or a horror film. It's a crock of shit. It's a comedy, horror, fantasy. And for me, it is done to a turn and done to perfection. Everyone in the cast bringing their A game in service of, from what I can understand, a really solid adaptation of Updike's very dense and very difficult novel, because he was not airplane reading John Updike. He was very, very serious stuff. But The Witches of Eastwick, now 38 years old, a classic film directed by George Miller and starring Jack Nicholson, Cher, Susan Sarandon, Michelle Pfeiffer, Veronica Cartwright, and the always fire Richard Jenkins. This has been episode 564 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your early Sunday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.